thank you so much. It's very nice to be with all of you guys tonight. And although I'm a little ashamed to say that this is my first Theology on Tap, I wasn't able to make the last one, so this is my debut. But I hope to be back, and I'm excited about our next speaker next week too with Father Whitney. We're all in for a treat with that one, so excited about that. But excited to be with you tonight, and thank you to Caitlin for inviting me and for the lovely introduction. So I'll just dive into it. When Caitlin first talked to me about coming and speaking tonight, and we were talking about the theme being about love of others, and I remember at the time thinking, gosh, that seems like a really big and broad topic to try and cover. And so in kind of reflecting on it in the last couple of weeks leading up to tonight, what has occurred to me in terms of how do you tackle a talk like this, like how the call to love others, it's so central, but it seems so huge. And there were two things that came up to me, or that occurred to me in terms of kind of how to talk about this. So tonight, I think where I will head is, tonight's talk is going to be a lot about two things. One is compassion, and the other is vocation. And to me, those two pieces are fairly central in the call to love others, and how each of us are called. And granted, each of us are called in very different ways because we have different gifts and talents. But I think the two core things connected to love of others is compassion and vocation, or at least it will be for the purpose of tonight. So, in terms of people, when you hear vocation, some people hear different things. Some people hear, that's connected to our jobs, or the work that we do, and things like that. And other people hear, kind of life status, like whether we're called to priesthood or religious life and things like that. Where I'd like to go with it tonight, it is connected to all of those things, but when I think of vocation, the central question that occurs to me is, what is God calling me to do? And that could apply to any given moment that we find ourselves. The question related to vocation is, what is God calling me to do in this moment? And then when we find ourselves in other situations, to ask that same question, what is God calling me to do? And to me, that's connected to this theme of loving others, because the God that I know, and I think that you know, is frequently calling us to love others and to pay attention to others. And so that's why, to me, there's this link between the call to love others and vocation. So what is God calling me to do? And then the second thing, and this is kind of my working definition of vocation, and this is not in any dictionary that I know of, this is kind of my made-up definition of when I'm talking about vocation, what that means to me is where your strongest gifts and talents and your heart's passion meets the world's greatest needs. So your gifts and talents and what you're good at, what you're naturally gifted in, what it is that is unique that you bring to the table, that you have to offer the world, or that cause, or those people that you feel passionately for, that, and then matching that with needs in the world that need precisely what you can bring to the table. And the work of vocation is really bringing those two things together, your gifts and talents and the needs in the world. And ultimately, I think that's what we're all trying to do. Now, the good thing about that is, we have a wonderful God who, A, knows the particular gifts and talents that we have. He knows that because God gave it to us. And he's also very acutely aware of the needs in the world that need those particular gifts that you have to offer. So the good thing there is that we don't have to work too hard, because God, knowing what we have to offer and knowing the needs in the world that need that, God is then going to call us toward those situations that need us. The tricky part with that tends to be we live in a very busy world, we live in a very noisy world, so oftentimes it is very tricky to hear God's call or to hear God's voice, to know where it is that God is actually pulling us toward. And so that's kind of where I'm going to take you tonight. What I'd like to do is essentially just tell you my story, and I'm going to highlight 3 stories tonight from my experiences of being a minister in some of the various places that Caitlin mentioned. And my story is essentially the story of God calling me to certain situations that match the particular gifts and talents that I have, a result of the gifts that I've received from God. And so what my hope is in telling this story is that you can kind of listen for, how was God calling me? How was I able to hear that call or that voice, to know where it even was that God wanted me to go, or what it was that God wanted me to do? Again, that key question associated with vocation. And how did I even know that I was on the right track? How did I know that I was indeed responding to God's call in the way that God wanted me to, or that I was in the right spot? And lastly, where I'll go is the question that I'll toss out is, in the face of God's little ones, to kind of reference Matthew 25, when you are called to be in relationship with those special people, which I think all of us are in our Catholic tradition, how can we not love others in kind of a radical way? And so that's where we'll head. But I'm gonna, before I get into my stories, I'm gonna kind of put out a spoiler alert, and I'll identify the particular gift that God has given me that is related to the three stories that I will relay to you tonight. And that is the particular gift that I would identify as my strongest gift, and that has played a central role in the ministry that I've been able to do in terms of my attempts to love others in the world in the way that God has called me to. So my particular gift that I'm claiming and identifying tonight is pastoral care, kind of a churchy term. But are you familiar with the strengths finders? How many people know what their 5 top strengths are in the strengths finder? If you do that process, it'll spit out those 5 top strengths. My number 1 on the strengths finder is empathy. So in essence, the ability to feel with another, to enter into the situation or the feelings or the shoes of another person and really kind of take that on and feel what they're feeling as they're feeling it, kind of go through it with them. That is a gift that I have, so it's no secret that I ended up in pastoral ministry. I mean, that's one of the core roles of pastoral ministry, is to enter into the experience and the journeys and the feelings and the experiences of others, and going through it with them, and holding those burdens and sharing those joys and just being with people. And you'll see how God used that with me to kind of build God's kingdom in the world. So that's my particular gift that I'm claiming tonight, and that is the gift where God called me to certain situations to love others. And not only that, but in terms of the passion that I discovered in that was a real love for young people. My whole entire ministerial career has been about care of young people, and particularly at-risk young people, whether they be in the foster system or in the juvenile justice system, or whether they be orphaned and abandoned in other countries. So definitely have a heart for young people at risk. So that's the passion, and that's the gift. So the journey now is, God knows that I have that passion, and God knows that I have this particular gift. And the question way back when was, what were the needs in the world that needed that? Where was God pulling me at to be able to use those? So to begin my story, it started back not long after I was out of high school and was starting college at Seattle University. I was, my journey starts with a newspaper article, of all things. I was getting ready to go to class that day, and was just reading the morning paper and having my breakfast. And there was an article in the paper about some group home up in Snohomish County. And I honestly don't remember what the particulars of the story was. I don't remember what happened at the group home that made it noteworthy enough to be in the paper. That's not what caught my attention. What caught my attention was that there was such a thing as a group home. And at the time, as an 18, 19-year-old, whatever I was, I didn't know that this was something that was in the world. I didn't know that there were communal homes that was taking care of young people who, for whatever reason, could not live with their families of orphans. And All I can say is that in encountering that newspaper article, and again, this is where we start to find how does God call us or pull us toward the situations in the world that need us. All I can describe it as is it was a tug. It was a tug of the heart. It's almost like there was an invisible string connected to that newspaper article that connected directly to my heart, and it was literally pulling my heart toward that situation. And again, that was even before I even understood the need or even understood what that was all about. But there was a tug there. There was something that just drew me naturally to that. So I took that tug and I took it to my social work professor at Seattle U. And I showed her the article and said, what's the deal with these group homes? And I didn't know anything about this, and what is this about? And she went on to tell me that, that's one of the ways that we take care of young people in our foster care systems in these group homes in the communities. And you're going to have to do your internship, somewhere in the community for your degree. And we happen to have a relationship with a local group home in North Seattle. Perhaps you'd be interested in going to this group home and doing your internship there. So again, in responding to kind of that natural tug, I said yes to that. So all of a sudden I found myself standing in the living room of a little brown house in North Seattle. It's in the Greenwood neighborhood, kind of out by Blanchette High School. And it was a 6-bed facility for young men in the foster care system. So again, these are kids who are either abused or neglected or for whatever reason could not live with their original families. And they were being cared for by a team of counselors at this house. Was interviewed and decided that, yes, indeed, that was where I wanted to do my internship. So I took it on, and my job at the time was, like I said, there were 6 guys in the house. And so they wanted me to come once a week and to take the guys out one-on-one, one at a time. And so one week I would grab one kid and we'd go out to the community and we'd go shoot basketball in the park, or we'd go to a movie, or we'd, do something so the kid could have some one-on-one attention and things like that. And then I would come back the next week and I'd grab the next kid and we'd go. And I did that for a year. And in doing that, really became, or able to kind of get to know these kids and starting to kind of listen to their stories and things like that. Well, at the end of that internship, the group home approached me and said, well, we know your internship is ending, but we kind of like you to stick around. So would you be interested in actually being one of our part-time group home counselors? Which I remember laughing at the time because I said, well, I haven't even finished my degree yet. They said, well, that's okay. We know you're working on it, and we'd just like you to come on board. So I said yes to that. And so at 19 years old, I became a part-time staff counselor at the group home. It was called Gamma House. And that started an 8-year journey of working with young men who found themselves in that particular situation. Well, that's when I started to realize that there was something unique that I had to offer that matched the needs that were inherent in this particular place. And that's when I first began to really understand what my gift was, that today I can clearly articulate as my gift is pastoral care, my gift is empathy, my gift is spiritual healing. I can own it and name it and claim it today. At 19 years old in that group home, I could not have said that to you. I was still in the process of figuring that out. But God knew precisely where I needed to be to begin to understand that gift and to be able to apply it. So here comes story number 1 that I'm going to offer tonight about one of the young people that I was called to love. His name was Danny. He was 14 years old. The first time I saw him, I was just coming in for work for a normal swing shift, 3 to 11. Was driving into the driveway of the group home. He was standing across the street. He was a new resident. I'd never seen him before. And he was standing across the street smoking a cigarette. Cool guy. So I parked and walked across the street, extended a hand and introduced myself and, how are you? And, we kind of met each other. And in the next few weeks, I kind of experienced Danny to be kind of a sullen kid, very reserved, very quiet, kept to himself, kind of had an air of, you just sensed that he was angry all the time, probably because he was, and kind of a difficult kid to get through, or to get through to. Well, there was one day in particular where Danny kind of migrated over to the couch in the house and kind of sat himself down, and just kind of seemed lost in his head or lost in thought. There wasn't a whole lot else going on in the house at the time, so I took a risk and I went over and sat at the couch across from him and just kind of put it out there. You know, hey Danny, how you doing? What's going on? Well, all of a sudden, for the first time, Danny started to open up and started to share his story and started to share things that he had never shared with me or really with any of us before, and just telling his story. And his story was, as he related to me at that time, was his family of origin. There was mom, dad, him, and his younger sister. His younger sister suddenly died of some kind of heart malfunction. It was kind of one of these things where no one could have done anything, and it was just an unfortunate tragedy. And his father, who was already alcoholic but functional, dealt with that loss by diving deeper into his alcoholism, which unfortunately produced very, very abusive behavior. And so essentially he had been beating Danny pretty severely for a while before the state became aware that this was going on, and then entered in and pulled Danny out of that home, which is why he was with us in the group home. Meanwhile, his mother, who also I'm sure was completely engulfed in grief over the loss of their daughter, she dealt with it by turning to hardcore drugs. And eventually the drugs consumed her life, and she actually left the family completely, lost in the drug world. What 14-year-old Danny would say to me sitting on that couch, that I can still, even thinking about it, I can still feel what came over me in that moment. But he looked at me and he said, in reference to his mom, she chose drugs over me. She chose drugs over me. He was a 15-year-old young man struggling with something of that level. And all I remember was the pain of that, or the experience of that, washing over me like a wave. Like for a moment I took it on as if that was my story, as if that was my reality. And I felt the pain attached to that. Now, I didn't know it then, but that was my natural gift from God kicking in terms of if somebody trusts you enough to let you into their world and to share their some of their deepest stuff. But the gift that I had was the ability to empathize with that, or to enter into that, to experience it for what it was. What I've learned over time is that doing that is healing. Very healing and very helpful to the other. I didn't know that at the time. And in fact, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of young men in Gammon House during that time that were like that. Now granted, I was pretty green at the time, so was still sort of learning how to use my gift. So at the time, when young people would share stuff like that with me, I had a tendency to talk a little bit too much. Maybe go into advice-giving mode, or trying to fix whatever the problem was, which is a very common rookie mistake for anybody who is a helper personality, of which I am. And so, so definitely I was still learning, how to use my gifts in a way that's loving others to the best that I could. But it's interesting how it works in terms of how God calls us to where we need to be, and that part of that is about developing our gifts. The interesting thing is I'm still in a relationship with Danny to this day. He's 29 years old now. He texted me actually right before I got up here. And he's hanging in there. He's doing okay. One of the things he told me fairly recently, it was probably about 4 months ago, and he said, do you remember that conversation on the couch way back when? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, that was really helpful, because you really helped me to express myself and how to get things outside of myself and not keep this stuff locked up. And that has been helpful to me moving forward. Now again, that's a piece of feedback he could give me all those years later. I didn't have that feedback at the time, but it reminds me of God calls us where we need to be. Even when I was green and rookie and really didn't know what I was doing, God called me to a place and to a situation where I could be helpful and I could be healing, and the grace of God could enter through me and make something happen in that situation that is good and helpful for the other. So it becomes about this: how do we trust where God is calling us to be? And again, always asking that question: what is God calling us to do, and how are we called to use our gifts in those situations? So, but again, funny how God works. Because again, still green, still learning my trade, still learning my talent and how to use it. And of course, God, who knows everything, and He knew what was on the horizon. I didn't, and He knew what I needed to move on to the next phase. And I didn't. And the whole thing kind of unfolded in the following way. The next call of God, in terms of the next situation that God was calling me to, that matched what I had to offer, came in the form of a pink slip. Because I got a call one day after 8 years at the group home, I got a call from the supervisor, and he said, I don't really know how to tell you this, but we were a small hole-in-the-wall agency, and he said, we've lost a bunch of our funding, we're not, the numbers aren't, we can't support the agency, and we're closing programs. And unfortunately, Gamma House is one of the programs that we're closing. So I'm essentially telling you that you're losing your job. So again, I'm on the other end of the phone, and I'm standing there thinking, again, that question related to vocation pops up, which is, well, what am I called to do in this situation? What is it that God wants me to do in this situation, standing there all of a sudden without a job, without a mission? Like I say, God was working on that long before that moment showed up. I didn't know that, but several months prior to that, I had gotten involved with an organization that many of you are either familiar with or going to become familiar with. How many of you are going on the Nicaragua mission trip? Woo! All right. So I had come into contact with this organization, again, a few months before this pink slip showed up. And for me, it was there was a church that was hosting an event for this orphanage called Nuestros Pequeños Hermanos, or NPH, as we commonly refer to it. It's a group of kids that were putting on a performance to raise money for the homes. These were orphaned and abandoned children throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And they had those little sponsorship boards, with the pictures of the kids in the orphanage, and they want you to sponsor a kid and pay your $30 a month and write letters back and forth. And at the time, walking into this, again, I had no idea what was coming on the horizon, but at the time, there was another one of those tug moments, just like that newspaper article. And for me, it was standing in front of that sponsorship board, and I was looking at a photo of a young man in Nicaragua. His name was Alvaro. And same thing, that invisible string that was connected to that picture that went straight to my heart, and there's that tug again. And without really knowing where this was headed, I responded to that tug and sponsored the young man on that board, having no idea that that decision was going to turn into this enormously life-altering experience. But there you have it. So I sponsored the kid, didn't think much of it, thought I'd pay my $30 a month, I'd write a couple letters back and forth, thought it was a nice thing to do. I thought that was going to be it. But all of a sudden, fast forward a few months, and I'm on the other end of that phone, and I've got the pink slip, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Then all of a sudden, there was a connection with that orphanage that was occurring to me, because one of my buddies at the time, who was more involved in the organization than I was, he had said to me, Joe, you would make a great international volunteer. And I remember at the time I laughed that off, and I completely dismissed that immediately and said, well, that is the most ridiculous thing ever. The thought of me going abroad or whatever, that just did not even seem like it was within the realm of reality. I was like, I'll pay my $30, I'll write the letters back and forth, that's a very nice thing to do. But standing on the other end of that phone and having just lost my job, it was his words that are echoing in my head. Joe, you would make a great international volunteer. Just echoing over and over in my head, that which I had dismissed so quickly. And that echo of his words literally became the voice of God inviting me to what was next. Inviting me to another need in the world where there were others that needed to be loved, and others that needed to be served, and others that needed to be loved and served via the particular gift and talent that God gave me to offer. So there's the call, there's the vocation coming through. So I responded to that, and to my utter surprise, all of a sudden I found myself selling my condo and selling my car and taking everything I owned and putting it in storage. And all of a sudden, in a fairly short amount of time, I went from ministering in a little brown house in North Seattle with 6 kids to finding myself on a remote island in the middle of Nicaragua at an orphanage, now caring for some 350 orphaned and abandoned children in a language that I didn't entirely speak and didn't, so talk about a crazy, I never imagined in a million years that God would have called me there, but there I was, at the home, and at the very home that some of you are going to go and visit. Well, what's interesting about that in terms of God calling me to love others in that particular situation is, remember how green I was when I was at Gamma House learning my talent. Well, God, knowing that I had a tendency to perhaps talk a little too much or perhaps to get into advice mode, it seems like no shocker that he brought me to a place that forced me to shut up because I didn't have the language ability to be able to do that with the kids that I was serving. I didn't have the command of the Spanish language at the time. So all of a sudden I found myself in a situation where young people were pulling me aside and they were sharing some of those stories just like what Danny was sharing with me that day. And I had to, I couldn't do what I did, so I shut my mouth and I opened up my ears and opened up my whole just being completely present to these young people. And oh my goodness, that was where I start to realize how powerful that particular approach is, and how when you are just completely present to somebody and completely listening to their story, and you're not trying to fix anything or give advice or tell them it's going to be okay or any of this kind of stuff, but you're just listening and entering into that pain that they might be sharing, that's where grace enters and God's Holy Spirit can come through you and healing can happen for other people. So to me, in retrospect, no surprise that God called me to that particular place. Well, it was a crazy time. We lived on an island. The island was made up of 2 volcanoes. One dormant and the other active. And those of you who are going, if you can get an excursion out to that island, I highly recommend that. It's gorgeous. But we lived at the base of the active one. And one day, that sucker decided that it was going to explode and erupt, and we had this huge volcano erupting all around us. So within about a 24-hour period, we had rounded up all 350 kids and evacuated the island on a ferry, where we stayed off the island for 2 months. We had the girls in an abandoned hotel. We had 80 of the littlest boys in this nunnery that was meant for 10 people, and there's 80 little boys living there. We had a bunch of kids living in the main offices in San Jorge. Some were living in tents. It was craziness. Well, if you can imagine, if you're an orphaned child in a third world country, and you have just now, in a very abrupt way, been ripped from the security of your home, and you're now living in this precarious situation, and there's volcanoes exploding and just total craziness going on. As you might imagine, that brought up a whole lot of trauma and difficulty that was brought right to the surface in a lot of our kids. So, again, God had called me to this place that I never thought that I would be. But here I was, and there was this craziness going on, and this pain and trauma is coming up, and I had a talent to be able to just sit with that and receive that and feel that and provide a vessel of healing in that. So there was one young man that came to me. Well, it was my godson. It's the same young man that I sponsored off the board. And in the middle of that chaos, I noticed that he isolated himself one day and kind of removed himself and kind of went off to the side. And so same thing, there's that draw there. So I decided to take another risk, go check in. And that was when he started to share with me his story. His story was when he grew up, he had, his birth father had split before he was even born, so he never knew birth dad at all. His mom had gotten together with another man, and they had a daughter together, and that man kind of took Alvaro on as his, as his son, basically, kind of adopted him. But after a handful of time, that guy took off and left. Mom got together with a third fellow. The third fellow that she was with murdered her in front of him. He was 11 years old. So now you have an 11-year-old child who's just witnessed his mom murdered in front of him. The family responded by the sister, because she had a different father. There was paternal relatives down in Costa Rica. They came in and said, we'll take her, we'll bring her to Costa Rica, we'll raise her. That's where she resides to this day. Alvaro, on the other hand, who didn't have a connection to that family line, he did have maternal aunts and uncles, but nobody stepped up to take care of him. And again, I mean, Nicaragua's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. I don't think these were evil people that didn't want to. These are people that don't have the resources to be able to do that. So I think people couldn't step up to take care of him. The end result is, he was on his own, which is why he ended up in the orphanage at NPH with us. In that moment, that night, in the middle of the volcano evacuation, and he was telling that story, and there's so many elements of it, from the sense of abandonment that he carried because of his family, because why didn't anybody step up to take care of me? And not only that, but the trauma and the grief associated with losing his mom. And even though this was several years later, that was so raw, it was almost like it had happened just yesterday, in terms of him relaying. What do you do with pain like that? All we could do was sit in that area where we were and just cry together. Because there's nothing else that you can do with pain like that. There's nothing, people try like crazy to get rid of pain like that, and to cover it up, and to drink it away, or drug it away, or busy it away, or whatever. In that moment, we went straight into it, and we just sat and felt that pain together. My hope and my prayer is that the gift comes through in that the healing comes through in having someone enter into that pain and hold it with him for a little while. Always remains my prayer. But again, there were a lot of young people in Nicaragua who had similar crazy stories like that, and needed someone to just receive it, and to just feel with them, and to just take it on. So again, the key thing that's coming up for me here is compassion. So I'm responding to my vocation as best I can, being where I think God needs me to be. But in encountering these kinds of stories, it's my compassion that's getting triggered. That if you take on that pain, that's the only, what else can you feel? It's just pure, raw, unadulterated compassion that is driving me, or that's driving that, motivating me to even be there, to be doing what I'm doing. And believe me, there were nights when I would ask the question, what am I even doing here? What am I doing in this country where I don't speak the language and don't fully understand the culture? What in the world, or where I would doubt that I was in fact supposed to be there. And what's nice about God is that if we go to God in those moments, God will guide us through that. So the way that I handled that at the time is, I remember, again, we were on the island, and so I would go down to the edge of the lake at night, and this is not a wise thing to do from a safety standpoint, but whatever, it's what I did. But I would get into the lake and just float on my back, and just look up at the night sky. And let me tell you, the Nicaraguan night sky back me up on this. It is the most beautiful thing you will ever see in your entire life. It's nothing like the night skies we have here. Unbelievable. And so laying on my back, with the water up over my ears, so there's this different kind of silence that I'm experiencing kind of the heavens, or connecting with God on kind of a cosmic level, looking up at this gorgeous, amazing sky. And I would imagine that the water was God's hands physically holding me. And the reality is that while I was using my imagination, the reality was precisely that. Through the medium of water, God literally was holding me in a way that I could feel. And in those moments, not like the sky opened up and a booming voice came down and said anything to me, like sometimes you see in some of the Old Testament scripture passages and things like that. But there was this sensation that would come over me in those moments where all of a sudden I would just, it was very quiet, it was very subtle, but I would just suddenly know something that I didn't know before. And the message essentially was, you're where I need you to be. You're loving the people that I need you to be loving and serving and caring for. And I'm proud of you. And I would allow God to hold me in that water. And that helped me to continue to move forward and to continue to fuel my compassion so that I could move forward in whatever the needs were, or encountering the next kid who had a story, or whatever it was that needed to be done. When I got back from Nicaragua, I spent close to about a year and a half as an international volunteer with them. When I came back, that same vocation question comes up. God, what are you calling me to do in this particular situation? Well, again, God, knowing my gifts, which have been nicely honed in Nicaragua, and knowing the needs in the world, called me to something that needed what I had to offer. Only this time, the call came in the form of a literal telephone call. And it was Tom Wagner from the Seattle Archdiocese. And he called me. He knew I had a background in group homes and youth ministry and things like that. And he called me to just say, hey, there's an opening in the diocese for a juvenile detention chaplain, and would you consider applying? And so I mean, talk about a literal phone call, like God was calling me. And that just clicked. I mean, that just made sense in my head. Because I was like, at that point, I had much more of a grasp of what my particular gift was and what it was that I had to offer. And like I say, I had a lot more practice in using it. And I thought, okay, well, juvenile detention center, at-risk kids, there's going to be a lot of young people that are struggling with kind of crazy stories like I encountered at Gamma House and like I encountered down in Nicaragua. And I knew that I had something that was helpful in terms of listening and empathizing and entering into that and providing some healing. So I said yes. Again, that's another key part of loving others. It's that yes to what it is that God's calling us to, and saying yes and taking those risks. So now all of a sudden, I'm no longer in a third world country, but I find myself in a jail environment. And so again, I'm surrounded by young people who are desperately in need of the particular talent that I could offer. So I spent the next 5 years sitting in a library listening to story after story after story of young people who have been through stuff that I can't even begin to imagine. And the one story that occurs to me that has stayed with me the most was Ben. Ben was 16 years old. His story was he had a single mother, dad, same kind of thing, where there was no dad. He had left the family long ago, didn't have any relationship with his dad. Mom was a single parent. She was disabled, but she was working 3 jobs to try and support 10 children. Single mom, 10 kids, plus she's disabled. Ben, who was among the older in the 10, he was the primary caretaker for the younger ones. So we're talking about a completely parentified youth who, even though he's a young person, he should be out playing basketball, going to school, getting in trouble, the normal things. Instead, he has absolute adult responsibility. So he's the one who's getting these kids up every day, getting them ready for school, making their lunches. He's receiving them when they come home from school, making sure they're doing their homework. He is absolutely playing the role of a full-time parent. Meanwhile, he's doing this with what we like to call in pastoral ministry father wound. which is that hole, that pain, when somebody doesn't have a father in their life, there is that wound, and he had it hardcore. But again, he's trying to be the father himself and take that on. Meanwhile, he had a grandfather with whom he was very close, and grandfather was kind of playing, that role of filling that need. And his grandfather died one day. Again, I think just natural causes, but all of a sudden he had lost the only person that kind of filled that dad role for him. So he had lost that and had the grief and the pain associated with that. So here's this young man, and again, we had several visits in the library and the detention center, and over time he was relaying this story, and there were different layers that we encountered at different times. But we dealt with the sense of abandonment in terms of his father and not having his father. We dealt with the anger that he felt over that while his peers were at school dances and on the soccer field, he was doing all these other things that an almost 16-year-old shouldn't be doing. And he was angry about that. And he felt guilty about feeling angry about that. He felt like he was being selfish for being angry about that. So that was part of our journey, was helping him to claim his anger and for that anger to be okay, for him to be experiencing that. And then the grief. And that was the hardest one. And that was the one that was the hardest for him to go to. But it was the loss particularly of his grandfather. And it was so raw, and I don't even think it had happened that much longer before. And the same thing when he started to talk about it. The pain was so raw and so right there, and again, he's trying everything to not go there. And yet together, sitting in a jail library, we cried together, and we grieved together, and we dealt with that pain together, and someone was able to carry it with him so that he didn't have to go through it all by himself. And that same healing that God throws through us happened for him, I hope and pray. So again, another situation where the needs meet what I have to offer. What's interesting, this is just kind of an aside, why he was there. This was not a hardcore criminal. He was there for two reasons: drugs and robbery. And the drugs was the marijuana that he was using to self-medicate, to deal with all this stuff that he was trying to keep at bay, that we were dealing with more directly. And the home robbery was, even with mom working 3 jobs, it wasn't enough to bring in what the family needed for 10 kids. So he was breaking into homes and stealing electronics, selling them, and buying food for the family. And he even took me through the first time he ever broke into a house and how crazy scared he was. He was like, what am I doing? But again, the situation seemed to propel that. So what I can tell you is after 5 years of working in a jail with kids that have done all kinds of things, I can tell you emphatically that I have never met a bad kid. And I have sat with rapists, murderers, thieves, you name it, the full gamut, and I have never met a bad kid. But what I met day after day after day after day was young people who were suffering and hurting at levels that I struggled to comprehend. And they were stuck in that cycle that transmits that suffering to other people. So that was part of the ministry too, was identifying that cycle and then inviting them to instead transform their suffering by taking it to something that's more powerful than that suffering, which is God, and transforming it into something that's beautiful and something that's blessed for the world. That was the ministry. Nice thing about that too is same sort of thing, is that once I took on that job, there was a lovely scholarship attached to it at Seattle U, and so then I found myself doing my master's studies in pastoral ministry and actually really honing my talent. And there was classes called pastoral care skills where you're literally working on a particular gift that I had. So again, God calls us not only to where the needs are that meet what we have to offer, but also is honing us and preparing us and getting us stronger and better to do what we do to make the world into the place it's supposed to be and to respond to the needs and to build the kingdom of God. So what a blessing that is. So wrapping all the way around, what are these 3 stories, what is this all about? when we think about love of others, or God's call to love of others, or what does it have to do with, this topic tonight? And so here's how I'll wrap up. It's all connected. It's connected to a couple things, but it's connected completely to the ministry of Jesus. So if we look at the Gospels and look at how Jesus was spending his time and the particular things that caught his attention, or the particular situations that had that tug that pulled at Jesus' heart, we know that a lot of the young people that I was pulled to by God matched the same kind of demographic that Jesus was so intently interested in the Gospels. And so the Gospels is packed with story after story after story of Jesus finding those people like the Dannys, like the Alvaros, like the Bens, but in the first century, people who were hurting, people who thought they weren't good enough, people who thought they were the lowest of the low, people who were in such pain that they couldn't even, and Jesus' compassion is being ignited, and he's responding to that. And that's where we're going with this tonight. In the original Greek, which was the original language that the Bible was written in, there is a word, and I swear it's about this long. I could not even hope to pronounce it properly for you. But it's the Greek word that's in the original scripture that's used to describe, it gets translated in our Bibles as Jesus was moved with pity. That's the word that they tend to translate it as, is pity. And I think it's a pity that they picked that word, because it's not helpful. That word, I think, is more accurately translated as compassion, and even compassion doesn't even quite catch it. And Jim Martin from the Jesuit order talks about a better way to understand that word is it's a level of compassion that is so strong and so deep that you feel it in your guts. That's how deep the compassion is. Jesus wasn't moved with this sort of surfacey pity, like, oh, I feel sorry for you. It was this deep, rooted, internal compassion. In other words, that feeling the horrors or the difficulties or the challenges of what someone else is going through and empathizing with that so deeply that everything in your being wants to respond to that because the compassion is felt so deep. Jesus' ministry again and again and again is that. And that happens in the modern world. It happens to us. When God calls us to certain situations or to certain people or to whatever, the question becomes is, where is our compassion getting triggered like that? Because I'll tell you what, when it was me and I was sitting across from Danny and hearing about the pain of his mother choosing drugs over him, or sitting with Alvaro and just letting the tears fall down our face over the murder of his mother and the loss of a family that couldn't help him, or sitting with Ben and mourning the loss of his grandfather or the loss of his childhood, and the pain of that being so acute, and me being so filled up with that. And all you can do is fall in love with these people and be filled with that compassion. And when that happens, how can you not devote your whole life, your whole being, your whole self to responding to that? And that's why compassion and vocation, God will pull us to those situations. God will pull us via the heartstrings and via the compassion. God will get us to the situations where we need to be based on the particular talents that we have or the particular people that we need, whatever. But it's that compassion and that connection and that love of the other that how can we not lay down everything, and respond? That's the call of the gospel. That's the call to love others. And in fact, it mirrors our very understanding of who God is. We understand God to be a community of persons, for lack of a better way to say that. But God is a community of being. So even within the very reality of God, there is other. There is an other within God. And the very nature of the Trinity is you have the lover, which we would call God, there is the beloved, which is what we would identify as Jesus, and then there's the love between the two that proceeds forward, which we would identify as the Holy Spirit. Lover, beloved, and the love that proceeds. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The very reality of God is that God is pouring himself out, emptying himself in love of the other, and vice versa. And that something proceeds out of that almost electric back and forth sharing of love between the Father and the Son. But it's that issue of in order for that to work, they have to literally empty themselves, pour themselves out in love of the other. And then something in doing that proceeds from that. So when we think about us being made in the image of God, and children hear that and think that God has a head and arms and legs, that's where I go. That we're made in the image of God because we mirror that inner reality of the Trinity. And the cross is precisely that. What is the cross? The cross is Jesus' life poured out for others. That's what the cross is. And then in doing so, there's new life. There's the resurrection. And the Trinity, that reality, the inner life of God, the Trinity of emptying yourself and pouring yourself out in love of the other, the way God pours himself out for love of the Son and vice versa. We are called to mirror that. And so we do it in a lot of different ways. Now, my vocation has been as a single person. Other people have lived that vocation out in an ordained way or in a religious way, and still other people will live out that vocation as a married couple. Married couples are a beautiful example of the inner life of the Trinity, where you're pouring yourself out in love for your partner. And that shared love between the two of you, something proceeds from that. A new life. Or something new for the benefit of the world. We're mirroring the inner life of the Trinity. And it all is about the other. The other. Even in the inner life of God, there's other. So when I encountered the other in the young people that I was called to serve, and I was triggered with that same kind of compassion that I believe Jesus was triggered by, how could I do anything other than what God is continually doing in every moment, which is pour myself out, pour my life out for that other, for love of that other, for those kids that I was called to serve, for the relationships that I was called to be in, and absolutely give my life over out of love and compassion and make that my vocation of every moment of every day. And we're all called to do that. And we're called to do it in different ways. For me, it was working with young people, and it was, and my particular gift was pastoral care. For you, your gifts are going to be different. So God's going to call you to different scenarios. God's going to call some of you to relationships to live that out, to love other in that way. Some of us are called to do it through a single vocation like I've been doing. But it's all about mirroring the Trinity, following that compassion, and pouring ourselves out for love of the other. Thank you so very much.
Great. Thank you, Joe, so much for sharing such a heartfelt story with all of us. I think pretty easy takeaways, how to take compassion and what God's calling us to do, matching that with the gifts that he's given us and the vocation of how we're supposed to call it out. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Part of the reason why we're here tonight, obviously, to also help advocate and fundraise for the mission trip coming up. So John here is going to help talk a little bit more about what the mission trip is.
Thanks, Allie. Thanks again, Joe. Wow, what a talk, huh? Very nice. I want you all thinking